Shareware, shareware, shareware. I've talked about it multiple times on this channel, and I stand by the notion that there were lots of great games released under the shareware model. Now, the coolest thing about shareware is that any amateur programmer could make a piece of software, insert a terrifying 16-bit color image of themselves into it, and ask for $5.52 to support their passion project. The worst part about shareware was that very same thing. Regardless of quality, software that can be freely distributed by anyone can also very easily be thrown on a CD with a bunch of other crap. Thus, the shareware compilation disc was born. Yes, the mass adoption of the CD-ROM ushered in an era of physical shovelware, the likes of which the world has yet to see again. At least until the Wii got released, but that's a completely different thing. Now, the undisputed king of shareware game compilations was Galaxy of Games. Released by RomTech, who would later become E-Games, these collections were released through the mid-90s all the way up until the mid-2000s when CDs and DVDs sort of started to die down. Personally, I always had these types of collections around growing up. I don't even remember where most of them came from. I certainly don't remember us buying any of them, but they were always there, and I kind of liked looking through them. Back when I was a kid, at least. What are they like now? So I have here the very first Galaxy of Games disc. There are 300 games on this very CD, and I'm going to play every single one of them and see if there's anything worth talking about in 2025. At the end of the video, I'll rate this collection as a whole, and if you guys like it, I will cover the rest of the Galaxy of Games collections, because there are certainly a lot of them. So for now, I'm excited to get into this, so pull up a chair, maybe grab a coffee. I think this is going to be a long video. Before we start playing the games, this is a good time to mention that almost every game on this disc is Windows 3 based, which is concerning from a quality standpoint. The total size of the games folder on the disk is also an underwhelming 97 megabytes, which means that the average size per game is probably around 300 kilobytes. There do seem to be 312 games here in total, so at least they didn't lie about the game count. So with our Galaxy disc loaded, we get this ugly little interface with 12 different categories, and I'm going to show you what I think are the best, or at least most interesting games from each one. I obviously can't show everything, or this video would be like 4 hours long, so only the ones that are good or weird enough. So without further ado, let's get to our first category. So first here we have arcade games. There are 43 games in this category, and predictably, we have lots of clones of classic arcade games like Breakout, Tetris, Pac-Man, Asteroids, and Missile Command. Some of these aren't bad, like Bricklayer here, which is a competent Tetris clone with some music reminiscent of GoldenEye 64. Trust me when I say that sound and music are definitive features of any game on this disc. I'm not trying to be too negative here, but there's not a whole lot of sound. But there is some good stuff. For one, we have Castle of the Winds. I wouldn't really consider this an arcade game, but I'm not complaining. This is probably one of the best RPG roguelike games for Windows 3.1, and I'm a sucker for this type of thing. Don't get me wrong, this is an outlandishly ugly game, but dungeon crawling doesn't really need to be beautiful to be entertaining. I would consider it to be inferior to the likes of Valhalla and NetHack, but you can still burn quite a bit of time slaying monsters and exploring the world. Big thumbs up on this one. The next one I found interesting was Dominate. This is one of those grid-based games where you try to take over the map with colored squares, and the computer is a huge dick that's impossible to beat. Maybe I'm just bad. Still, the graphics are nice by Galaxy of Games standards, and I did spend some time screwing around trying to win. I never did, of course, but you know. Moving on to something a bit more substantial, there is Microman. I vaguely remember this one. I think this is one of those games that seems to squeak itself into quite a few different Galaxy collections. And it's the best platformer on the disc. It's also the only platformer on the disc, but beggars can't be choosers, right? Gameplay-wise, it is similar to Electroman, which I covered in my last Shareware video. If you watched that video, you know that isn't necessarily a compliment. I will say, it's slightly better than Electroman, and has some definite Mega Man influences in terms of combat that make it a more balanced game. Unfortunately, I still find it really hard to like. The controls are awkward, the character movement is crazy slow, and restarting the entire game after losing 3 lives or whatever is kind of the pain cherry on top. Next, we have more arcade games that are totally not arcade games. This is Palace of Deceit, The Dragon's Plight. To me, the most interesting thing about this game is that it's one of the first games released by young Cliff Bleszinski of Epic Games fame. At its core, it's an old text parser adventure game with a graphical interface thrown on top. You play from the perspective of a dragon, which is certainly different, and the story elements seem well written for the little that is here. If you like this type of game, it is serviceable enough, and considering the graphics were all created using MS Paint, it looks decent. However, the tiny window makes mouse navigation a bit tiresome even at 640 by 480, and the whole thing is basically just a hidden object game. Even so, I think this is an impressive effort by a teenage Cliff, and an interesting piece of history. Moving on, our next game is arcadey for once. This is Polly Python. Yes, this is a snake game that closely resembles the ones you find on old Nokia phones and Dingus Land alike. Despite that, this version mixes things up a bit compared to most iterations of this classic. Instead of a static screen where you play until you lose for the highest score, Polly has scrolling maze-like levels with a set number of mice to find and eat. As per the rules of the original game, each mouse eaten increases the length of your snake, making maneuvering levels more difficult as time goes on. If you manage to collect all the mice in a given level, you advance to the next maze, but you also maintain the size from all the mice you ate previously. This feature makes the game challenging after the second or third level due to the massive size of your snake. Man, without context, that sounds really weird. Regardless, I like this version of the game. Up next is our last game in the arcade category, and what do you know? It's not an arcade game at all. This is Quenzar's Caverns. To me, this is by far the best game I played on this disc. As I mentioned with Castle of the Winds, I'm partial to traditional roguelikes and love them to pieces, so that may be a factor in some potential bias. Aside from the fact that I really like saying the word Quenzar for some reason, I think Quenzar's Caverns pulls off a casual roguelike experience very well. The goal of the game is to defeat the evil wizard Quenzar, which is why I assume you're in his caverns. It really does make you wonder what old Quenzar did that gives you the right to trespass all over his caverns, but as far as I can tell, that was never fully explained.
What are you damn kids doing in my cavern?
As I was saying though, the beauty of this game is the casual nature of it. As stated by the developer in the documentation, if you're familiar with the game, you can finish it in under an hour, and with everything being randomized, it makes it a fun game to play over and over again in short bursts. Like most roguelikes, you can expect to die a lot before you figure out how to win, but the controls and interface for the game are very intuitive and easy to pick up. To play, you explore a small grid that is broken up into rooms. Rather than having a bump to hit combat system like Castle of the Winds, which I mentioned earlier, this game treats each enemy as an individual one-on-one encounter. This makes combat feel more like Pokemon rather than typical roguelikes where you can be ganged up on by multiple enemies. While there are ways to increase your strength with potions and scrolls, oddly, you don't level up in this game. Instead, you need to loot and find equipment to get stronger, which can be done by searching the rooms. This is a good design choice for a quick game because it means you just need to find all the right stuff instead of grinding levels to get to the end game. Overall, This is a very charming and well thought out shareware game in a sea of junk on this compilation. So that wraps up the arcade category, and what can I say other than it might be all downhill from here. Our next category is educational. This is the first of a few categories that are really devoid of any kind of good content. For a games collection, there isn't much here that resembles a game. There's a bunch of stuff like this abacus game, which isn't a game at all, it's just an abacus. And it's the same with this calculator app. The only things that are game-like here at all are this Simon game, a few puzzles, tic-tac-toe, and the obligatory match game. There's also a strange app called Wizard that is essentially a talking Magic 8 ball. The talking function does not work here on Windows 98 for some reason, but the WAV files in the game folder give you a pretty good idea of what this is about.
I won't say. How dare you speak that way? Unlikely.
Unfortunately, that is it for the educational games that are worth talking about. This is a good example of the disadvantages of this being an all-Windows collection. There are some great shareware edutainment titles if they would have just included some DOS games. Some stuff like Word Rescue or Treasure Math Hunt could have really beefed up the selection here, is all I'm saying. Our next category is sports. In total, there are 5 games in this category, but what is here is moderately okay. The first game is curling, which the description proclaims like a defensive Canadian is indeed a sport. I'm not going to pretend I know much about curling or even really understand all the rules, but I always find myself watching it when the Winter Olympics roll around. This simulation seems competent enough, and the physics seem alright. What kind of stinks is there doesn't seem to be a computer opponent option, so you need a friend to play this one with you. Good luck with that. The next game on here is Ski Free. Back in the day, this game was passed around more than, well, something that gets passed around a lot. Point is, everybody knows this one. You ski down the mountain, jump over stuff, and inevitably get devoured by a gray yeti. As always, it's fun for a few minutes of screwing around, and I'm sure was a big idle time waster for some at work back in the day. Sporting onward here, there's a mini golf game called The Greens, made by Shareware. I quite enjoy mini golf games usually, and this one has good animations, sounds, and music. However, it's not very fun and it's very tedious regardless of being well made. If you like a mini golf game that doesn't cut you any slack from the first hole onward, maybe you could find enjoyment from it, but it's definitely not for me. The last 2 sports games on here are a lame, unlicensed NFL sim and a pool game that performs illegal operations. So let's move on. Next, we have the aptly named board games. Mind you, I like a good board game, but most of these are just uninspired clones of stuff like Yahtzee, Sorry, Risk, and the usual suspects like chess, checkers, and mahjong. There isn't much here worth checking out. If I had to pick any of them here, I would pick Seek and Destroy, which is a Battleship clone, and a Metallica song. Really, the only reason I like this one is because the sound effects are very clearly just some guy making mouth sounds in a microphone. The next category we have is practical jokes. These programs are self-explanatory and don't really do much. Most of these didn't work properly on a Windows 98 system like I have here, so I went out of my way to get these working in DOSBox with Windows 3.1 for the sake of being thorough. If you played any of the old virtual pet type stuff in the early 2000s or even Bonzi Buddy, these are basically just even more simplistic, primitive versions of that. So yeah, silly desktop toys that are silly. There are about 12 of them here in total. You got roaches that run around the screen, a coffee cup you can spill, a cat that'll follow your mouse, an Elvis detector, yeah, I don't know either, and some suitably dated jokes of the era, like this one which has cop cars chase O.J. Simpson's white Ford Bronco around your desktop. There are also multiple variations of these eyeball apps that follow your mouse around the screen. These programs are mildly amusing, but they're just like filler content on the CD, so let's move on. Next is war games. Alright, so I'm going to preface this by saying I do like strategy games. Heck, Crusader Kings 2 is one of my favorite games of all time. However, most of what's in this category is just not my cup of tea. I would classify most of what is in here as grandpa games, and surely someone's grizzled History Channel grandpa may have enjoyed these a lot.
Holy crap, guys, look, it's a map! Holy crap, it's a tank! Like they shot at that German bad guy with the Charlie Chaplin mustache!
For me, though, I find most of them have very poor documentation and are clunky to play. However, I will say some of them seem like they could offer some good gameplay if you invested the hours to learn them. Panzerkrieg and World Empire 2 might have held my attention a long time ago, but I think there are just so many more worthwhile games that render these obsolete. Feel free to disagree in the comments, of course, so if you see your favorite game ever flashing on the screen right now, please forgive me, I just don't have the patience for them. Aside from these old strategy games, there is other stuff that doesn't really fit in here. More missile command games, and a few of these whack-a-mole-like mouse shooting games that really would have fit in better in the arcade section. So yeah, nothing too spectacular in this category. Let's move on to the next one. Unfortunately, the next 4 categories are also pretty uninteresting. Still, as I said at the outset, I ran through and still played all of these nevertheless, just to make sure I didn't miss anything good. So the next categories of lameness that I'm just going to kind of smash together are card, casino, puzzle, and word games. The card games are primitive versions of your basic solitaire games like Free Cell and Spider, which, enough said. The same goes for the casino games, which are almost exclusively slot machine games of dubious quality. To be honest, I never really understood the appeal of virtual slots in general, but if I had to pick one, I would say Win Slot here is the best, because it has animations and sounds. Remember, we have a low bar here, okay? As for the puzzles and word games, I was really hoping for some more interesting stuff, because even with limited graphics, you can make worthwhile games in these genres. The reality is, we don't get anything out of the ordinary. This is just a bunch of recycled game concepts like mazes, Hangman, Wheel of Fortune, Tetris yet again, and so many of these word cipher games. Does anyone actually like cryptogram puzzles? These are like the worst kind of word games ever, in my opinion. But there's a ton of them on here. The only game I'm going to mention by name here is Cyberspace Crossword. I bet you're wondering, am I mentioning it because it's good? No. I'm mentioning it because it's so abominable that it could be a snowman. This is a crossword puzzle game in 3D. Who asked for this? It doesn't play any different than a regular crossword, but the awkward controls and trying to move the camera around with scroll bars to fill in stuff just doesn't add extra fun in my opinion. Whoever made it, I give them credit for the different idea at least, but 3D certainly doesn't make everything better. Especially in this case. So now that we got all the riffraff out of the way, we can move on to the space games category. There are only around 12 games here, but at least a few of them have some redeeming qualities. The first one of note is Comet Busters, which I talked about in my first Shareware video about a year ago. This older version doesn't appear to run on Windows 98, but I'm showing archive footage of that video. Nevertheless, this is still one of the best asteroid clones ever made, and it holds up well today. It adds many fun new features to the game it's based on, most notably more ship powers and 4-player co-op and deathmatch modes. This is a game I would love to see remastered with controller support and online play for modern systems. For a Windows 3 game, it is also very impressive graphically and barely runs on this poor 25 MHz 486. In the same vein as Comet Busters, we have Hyperoid, which in name sounds like aggressive hemorrhoids, but is just another asteroid clone. It's inferior to Comet Busters, but at least it looks like a game, which meets my standards at this point. Marathoning all these games over the course of a few days was leaving me loopy, I suppose. Not much to this one, and it has no sounds, but the gimmick is that the ship has forward and backwards thrusters. So this makes controlling a bit different, and it's alright, I guess. Next, we have 3 different Star Trek games: Wind Trek, Stellar Explorer, and Wind Trek 2.0. All of these, of course, are based on the late 1970s mainframe Star Trek game, but with added graphics and sound. These are a dime a dozen and don't really have much depth, but I still find them fun to play casually. The goal for these is to destroy a set number of enemy ships within a time limit. The battles are grid-based, and you move between systems by warping and seeking out enemies using your sensors. The real challenge of these usually comes in managing resources and keeping your ship in good repair. Wind Trek is probably still the best of these, but roughly they're all the same game, give or take. The real game I want to talk about here is Elvis in Space. That's Elvis in Space, not Elvis in Space, okay? I'm still up in the air on if this is a good game, but it's certainly interesting. As the title suggests, it's a space game with Elvis. More specifically, it's a game about rescuing Elvis from space. In the game's own words, Elvis was taken from us by little green creatures, most commonly known as aliens, and well, this cheeky little storyline goes on for quite some time. All you really need to know is we need to find Elvis in space. And wow, look at this. It really can't be overstated how UI has evolved over time, and this looks like a complex mess. The good news is that this is a far more simplistic game than it appears to be. It takes quite a few notes from the Star Trek games we talked about in terms of navigation, but the combat is quite a bit different. Instead of grid-based movement, you can move your ship around freely in space in real time by clicking any spot in the ship window. You can also fire weapons while moving, which can give a slight tactical advantage at times. Your ship is also outfitted with a more varied array of weapon systems, almost to the point of making your ship a bit overpowered, especially on the beginner difficulty. Sometimes when you destroy enemy ships, you come across relics, which are key items to beat the game. With enough of these, you can invade the homeworld of the aliens and bring back Elvis. In a roundabout way, this is the same basic goal as the Star Trek games, and most of what you're doing is flying around, blowing stuff up until you win. Likely, this game would be much less memorable without its coat of Elvis paint that allows it to stand out. A brilliant marketing move, perhaps, but after doing a bit of research, it seems like this game was later renamed to Pelvis in Space to avoid legal issues. So maybe it worked a bit too well. Either way, this one is more fun to look at retrospectively than play, but it's not horrible or anything. So that wraps up the space games and brings us to our final category, which is Other. Everything in this category probably could be placed somewhere else on the CD, which leads me to believe they just dumped a bunch of stuff here last minute to bring up the game count to 300. There is some very othery stuff on here though. Right off the bat, we have this lovely 3-fish app. Wow. Eat your heart out, Serene Screen Marine Aquarium. There's also a potato disease simulator called Late Blight, which allows you to simulate the spread of blight on a potato crop set to your exact specifications. Yeah, I don't know how to spin that to sound more exciting than that. One of the odd ones I found interesting was this simple game called Engine. Each game, you get randomized symptoms as to why an engine won't start, and you have to replace the faulty parts. It of course gets old fast, but is still far better than anything else in the educational category, so I'm baffled as to why they didn't put it in there. The oddness continues with Mine Cheater, which is a cheat program for the Windows 3 version of Minesweeper. I don't really understand the point of this, as cheating at Minesweeper sounds like the most unsatisfying thing to do ever. Additionally, there are more toy-like programs similar to the ones they had in the practical jokes category. These eyeball programs are everywhere again, but I quite like this Wind Fight game. At the press of a button, it spawns a gunfighter placed randomly on your desktop that you must fire at quickly using the mouse. I'm not gonna lie, it's kinda satisfying for what it is. The rest of what is here is not worth going into in much detail. There is a text adventure game called Win Adventure, a Dr. Mario clone with a disgusting color palette, and a Wheel of Fortune game much like the other one I mentioned, but it has hideous PC speaker sounds that play on a loop. Well, this video was quite the undertaking. I captured hours and hours of footage making this. 300 games played and a handful that are sort of passable. This is not a very good collection, and if I had to rate it out of 10, I would give it a 2. That said, I'm not ruling out the possibility of subjecting myself to this again in the future if you guys like this video. There are many more Galaxy collections that I own, and at least a few of the later ones, like the Red Edition, are full of good games from what I remember. For now though, I'm a bit burned out on shovelware, so I will thank my lovely members on screen now and see you all next time.